So how do you learn astrology? You learn it by doing it. And you draw up charts, you get charts of your family, your friends, random celebrities, just anyone you can get charts of, and you study the charts. But how do you make sense of the charts? Well, there are a lot of sources and resources out there. And I actually, as much as I can, try to stay away from social media astrology. There is so much, first of all. And second of all, I find myself yelling at my phone when I come across it because I'm like, what are you talking about? And usually they'll keep going and I'll be like, oh, that makes sense. Or I'll just disagree with it and want to throw my phone out the window, which is why I try to stay away from it because I'm trying not to drive myself insane. But I wanted to go over just 26 of my favorite books. I'm not kidding. I warned you guys I was a nerd. This is me being a nerd. But if you want recommendations of good information that you can rely on, that's what I have here. These are books I refer to all the time. All of them. I'm not kidding. I also just like to passively read for fun. So I'm going to tell you these books that I love and why I love them, and you'll probably walk away from this buying some books if you haven't read them before. So, and I try to put them in order from kind of most accessible to everyone to some niche stuff that I'll talk about at the end. So they get progressively more complicated, and that's my rating system here. But I'm starting with the one that I'm the most biased about because this is also the book that I started with, Astrology for the Soul. It is about the lunar nodes. I feel that if you understand your Pluto by house and sign and also your lunar node situation, you know a ton more about yourself by the end of it than if you knew nothing at all. So lunar nodes, I don't know why, but they have a lot to say with some of your predispositions that you kind of came in with, already baked when you were born, or they speak to your early life experiences that inform how you act now. Why do they work? I don't know. And I'm not frustrated by it, but knowing your lunar node situation, Jan Spiller, there's another book that I'm going to talk about. She intended to write a book with information about what happens if you have planets conjunct either the south node or the north node, and she never did. She died before she could write those, but I found a couple of places where she said that she intended to write that book. So you have to take this book with a little bit of a grain of salt, because I do have planets conjunct my south node, and it does change my own nodal situation, but this was the gateway for me. You don't have to understand how to read charts in order to access this book. You just need to know when your birthday is. So and then you can also just start looking up your nearest and dearest based on when their birthdays are. You don't need chart information. So I'm biased. It was my first love in the astrology realm, but I recommend it, obviously. Hopefully I won't say that the whole video. Number 2, if you follow along with me and read the stuff that I write, this is the Bible. I apologize that it's cut off. I was doing this via screenshots on my Kindle app. Buy this book as in book form. Do not buy the digital version. Amazon published this, quote unquote, and it is a mess. They did not clean up the scan of the book. So I own the actual physical book. I bought the Kindle version because I like to access this on the fly. But it's not good in digital form. I own the original, so I'm not confused by what I'm looking at in terms of the scan that's uploaded. This is the Bible. This it tells you what your transits mean. It tells you how to do your transits mathematically. That's a crude way of saying that. But this is an understanding of how transits work to your birth chart. Again, you don't necessarily need a thorough understanding of your birth chart. You can use an astrology app to say, okay, I'm having a Saturn transit to my sun, and then you look up in this book what that means and what to expect. So that's the level. Again, I can get on my high horse about mathematic exactitude of transits, but I won't do that today. This is just, it's a good way to learn. And again, if you have charts of your nearest and dearest, you can look up their transits too, and then you can watch quietly without making a lot of suggestions about how they live their lives based on what transits they're having. Which, for the record, I did not do when I was learning. I thought every transit meant certain doom. So that's why I'm saying that way. Don't be like me. The best way to learn is to observe. You can also obviously look up celebrity charts and do the same thing. Stephen Arroyo, one of my favorite authors, multiple different books of his, but you can just take this as a blanket recommendation of Stephen Arroyo books. A lot of astrologers like to make things sound more complicated and make money off of that, of doing some really precise stuff. And it's not that precise stuff is wrong. It just makes astrology seem even more confusing than it already is, and even less accessible to the layperson than it already is. Stephen Arroyo does the opposite. He simplifies. He says, this is basically this. And so this is, I think, if you're going to buy one Stephen Arroyo book, it should be this book, because he covers most of it. What the different planets are, what they're about, what transits are about, what progressions are about, how to use progressions. It's all right here, and it's simple. That's the most important thing, is rather than getting lost, read a Stephen Arroyo book and it gets more simple. And if you're in over your head, do it slowly. But I really like Stephen Arroyo's books, and I think that'll be obvious as I keep going. This is another one. You don't really need both. He spends a lot of this book talking about elements, meaning, obviously it's astrology, psychology, and the 4 elements. He spends the first half talking about psychology and kind of defending astrology and why it works. So if you're on the fence about, is this even a thing, this is a good book. But if you want to learn basically how the elements work, which again, it seems reductive, and Stephen Arroyo is always trying to make things more simple, this is a good book for that. I recommend the earlier book, Astrology, Karma, and Transformation, but Astrology, Psychology, and the 4 Elements is kind of even more beginner. So that pick the first one if you're picking one. This is not the cover of Cosmic Love, but that is apparently the best that Kindle can do. The actual cover looks different. Cosmic Love is again a book about the lunar nodes, but it's about other people's lunar nodes relative to you, or you relative to them. This is an interpersonal book and a relationship book on how to relate to people who you care about based on their nodal structure. So this goes back to my original Astrology for the Soul recommendation. Jane Spiller books, get them all. They're great, they're accessible, they're easy to understand. I just recommend them. Celeste Teal. Again, there are a lot of books by her. There's another one in this list, but Celeste Teal learned and seems to work off of astrologers who are from previous generations. So again, this is another book on the lunar nodes. I think lunar nodes are super important, but Celeste Teal's work is a little bit more prescriptive than modern astrology, which is more you make your own destiny. So the Celeste Teal says some stuff on, this aspect is bad. Modern astrologers will all waffle and be like, it's challenging. We say challenging, we don't say bad. Celestial will just straight up say this is bad. There are a couple things in this book where it's like, you will die young. She doesn't say it like that, but there is the suggestion of like, this is bad, or this means an early death, and I was like, ah! So, it's a good book, it's a good reference manual. She also does the nodes by houses and has aspects to both the North Node and the South Node, which is part of why I recommend it, because you don't find a lot of good resources that have this information in a way that's easy to look up. Another Stephen Arroyo book. This is the one that we read and giggle. If you are dating someone new and you have their birthday, you can look up their chart without what houses things are in. If you do have their birth time, you can get their full chart. But this is information about what someone is like romantically, with information about moon signs, Venus signs, and Mars signs. These are all of the probably most important relationship planets. He does not really discuss sun signs, so this is not the book for that. But it is very functional and very useful and just fun. Like if you are at a party with a gaggle of women and you want to look up different signs and, again, giggle. It is a good reference manual for understanding people you might be interested in dating. I thoroughly believe that. All right. Howard Sasportas. Again, I absolutely love everything that he does. I will read anything that he wrote, or I will listen to anything that he said. He is very good. This is a more beginner book on planets and houses. So if you want to begin to understand what Jupiter in the 10th house, or Venus in the 2nd house, or Saturn in the 6th house, and I'm referring to the cover here, what those mean, what those look like, this is a great book for that. Again, beginner level, pretty accessible, easy to understand. We're back to Celestial. This is identifying planetary triggers. There's another book that she published that is predictive astrology. They're pretty much interchangeable. They're essentially like the same book, but just with different information. Every time I read a Celestial book, I get another idea about how to do astrology in a really technical way. Her information is dense. She was an astrology skeptic who learned to prove that it didn't work, and then obviously proved herself wrong, and then went on to write books. But those books are informed by stuff that people wrote in probably the 1920s that went out of print. So that's how she learned, and then she turned around and wrote several books. This one and then the other one that I just mentioned. They are dense. You, like, the bang for your buck is enormous if you are able to. I mean, if you read one time and get a method of doing astrology, the next time you read it, you'll get something else. Just, you want to be patient with it because she gives you a lot of information. This one and the other one, they're basically the same book. I only put one cover here, but just, you need to be patient. It's not exactly for beginners, so that's the caveat here. It's just she offers a lot of different resources for learning, which is why it's earlier on in my recommendations. Again, this one cut off, but Saturn, A New Look at an Old Devil. This probably says something about me, but this is a book that I like to read at the beach. I have fond memories of reading it for the first time on the beach. And again, it says something about me because Saturn is notoriously miserable. Like, everybody's like, ooh, Saturn, ooh, bad. But Saturn is the last planet that is quote-unquote conscious. So you can read it and understand your own Saturn, and most of the stuff that you'll read in this book, you'll be like, yeah, that's me, I do that. And it's consciously accessible to you. You then read Saturn by sign and house of the other people in your life, and you can say, oh yeah, they do that, or really, that's what's motivating that behavior. Oh, interesting. It's kind of a cathartic book, which is why I like to read it at the beach, because you're just sitting there like, oh, I get it. Liz Green is a prolific author. She publishes a lot. She published a book on Chiron earlier this year. I recommend Liz Green books generally, with the caveat that many of the books that she publishes are transcripts of seminars that she gave. So there sometimes lacks balance. She will talk a lot, for example, about Venus in Taurus and Venus in Gemini because she is speaking out loud at a conference, and then someone interrupts her, and she'll then give 2 sentences on Venus in Cancer and then skip to Venus in Leo. And so you will get a lot of information, but it won't necessarily be as evenly balanced as if she sat down and wrote an actual book. This Saturn book is her sitting down and writing an actual book. It's not a seminar transcript, so it is more even and more balanced and more straightforward. This is a really good book. Again, it helps to learn by planet and sign in the same way as Astrology for the Soul is about the lunar nodes, which is node sign, not even really node house. But Astrology for the Soul is kind of like the best possibilities of a sign or the worst possibilities of a sign. And then Saturn is Saturn in a sign, so it usually is kind of myopic and to the negative. But if you were to read both of these books, you would get a sense of what the signs are about functionally by what thing is in that sign. So Saturn versus the nodes. Again, just another good way to learn with the juxtaposition of Saturn versus, you could do nodes and signs. You could do any other book about planets and signs and houses. Okay, we are at the more niche section of this. If you have planets in the 12th house in your birth chart, if someone you love has planets in the 12th house in their birth chart, this is a really good book. Tracy Marks, really good author. I would blanket recommend anything that she's written, but this is the book that explains planets in the 12th house better than anything you're going to find. Period. The end. Some of her ideas on how to kind of remediate or deal with planets in the 12th house are a little eyebrow raising. And they were probably good for the time that they were written in, which is several decades ago. For example, she talks about Rolfing or primal scream therapy, where you read it and you raise an eyebrow and you go, I'm not doing that. But you get the idea of what she means. And I think primal scream therapy is for Mars and probably also Pluto in the 12th house. If you have 12th house planets, get this book, read this book. You will not be disappointed. It will make you feel like you're not alone, and you will see things in there that you're like, oh, that's why I do this? Because again, the 12th house is a subconscious house, so this is explaining planets functioning in a subconscious house. That's why you would want to read it. If you have Pluto problems, read Healing Pluto Problems. It's not that straightforward, that's why I'm laughing. Donna Cunningham is the shit. She's dead, but her blog lives on, and she published a number of books. She self-published a number of books, and so I think that those self-published books are getting harder and harder to find, because you used to be able to buy them through her website and receive them as a PDF via email. But they're all good. They're all very useful. She was an astrologer who worked with everybody. She was a social worker first, and then she learned to read charts, and she was working with people who had like capital P problems. She herself is Plutonian. That's why she wrote this. So if you have a Sun-Pluto aspect, if you have a Mars-Pluto aspect, if you have Pluto in either the first house or the eighth house, this is your book. Again, she wrote for the age that she was in, so there's like healing with color and light and some hippie stuff where, again, you raise an eyebrow and you go, I'm not doing that. But that aside, this is a good book. If you or someone you love has Pluto problems, you will recognize yourself. You don't have to tell anyone that you recognize yourself. You can just read the book and keep it to yourself. That's what Pluto people do. If putting this on my list helps one person, I'll have done my job. It's a good book. You should read it if you have Pluto problems. Again, yads have kind of been my thing lately, but if you have a yad in your chart, if you know what I'm talking about, you know. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you can ignore this. But the yad book, as this talks about unaspected planets as well. So if you have a planet that does not make any aspects to anything else, this is also, it's just as good. Yads and unaspected planets have a lot in common. Probably if you have a yad or an unaspected planet, you're not aware of it. This is a niche book, but if you know that you have one of these things, I thoroughly recommend reading it because it'll give you a lot of useful insights. This is a more complicated version. How to Handle Your Human Relations is a more complicated version of the Stephen Arroyo person-to-person astrology book I already recommended. For this, you need to be able to read your own chart as well as somebody else's chart to see what the different interactions are, planet to planet. Super good, though. I have not been steered wrong by this book one time, and it has some eyebrow-raising stuff in it where you read it and you go, really? And then you later discover how very, very true it is. So if you're at the level that you can understand your chart in relation to someone else's chart and you would like that decoded, this is a book that actually Stephen Arroyo recommended within one of his own books. So he basically said, I'm not going to get into this. Read the Lois Haynes Sargent book. So I got the Lois Haynes Sargent book. It's that simple. Relationship and life cycles, Stephen Arroyo. I think it's pretty obvious. I like the man. This is a less complicated book, and I think this is the book where he recommends the book that I just recommended. But again, you need to be able to read your chart and see it in relation to someone else's chart to have it have the payoff. So if you're at that level, this is a great book for that. And again, he makes it as simple as possible. It's not majorly complicated. And the previous book that I recommended, also, it's not majorly complicated. You just basically need to have eyes and see, oh, this is square to this, or this is opposing this, etc. Erin Sullivan, blanket recommendation for anything she writes, but Saturn in transit, very, very, very useful. I like Saturn-based books because they are straightforward. Saturn is one of the more straightforward planets, and Saturn transits the last 9 months. So if you have a Saturn transit, which you're gonna every year or every other year at least, Saturn will be doing something relative to something in your chart, and you would like to know how you can improve the most or benefit the most or make the most, because with Saturn, if you work, it pays off. So if you want to be proactive and think, how can I make this work for myself? This is a great one. Erin Sullivan, pretty straightforward. I don't think that this is terribly complicated, and you can just read sections of it for what your transit is and then come back later and read another section. But she'll give you the totality of what Saturn is and what it's doing, and then kind of breaks it down by this in transit to this, or Saturn in transit to this, thing. So, really good for that. Another Aaron Sullivan. Okay, this is still niche. Aaron Sullivan breaks down what it means to have certain planets retrograde in your chart. So if you have Mercury retrograde, Venus retrograde, or Mars retrograde, you would want this book just for the several pages that she talks about what that means for you in your life. She also talks about outer planets retrograde, both in your natal chart and then the actual experience of what it is they're doing every year, because they go retrograde every year. So she talks about the whole retrograde cycle, meaning that when the outer planets go retrograde, as well as Mars, which technically Mars is beyond us, but when I say outer planets, I mean Jupiter on out. There are certain cycles, like the sun will trine the planet, and then it'll square the planet, and then it'll oppose the planet, and then it'll square the planet, and then it'll trine the planet, and then it'll go direct. And I think in Mars it's the reverse in terms of the function, but I'm getting a little lost here, so I won't continue to try to describe it to you, because that's what she does in the book. So this is kind of the function of it, and what tends to happen at what time with these aspects. So this is pretty nerdy, but it also works. So again, I really recommend it. She died this past winter. Very smart person, very good at writing accessibly about astrology. Howard Susportis, again, this is another one of his. I think I said I would read anything that he wrote. He's dead too. But this is for understanding outer planet transits to your birth chart. So this builds on planets in transit. That's why I put Rob Hand's planets in transit first. But if you wanted a more detailed description of what different transiting planets do to planets in your birth chart and what to expect, this is a really good one. Tracy Marks. Again, she's the 12th house book that I recommended earlier. This one is just like Celestial, meaty, helps you understand your birth chart, helps you understand transits, helps you understand astrology as a tool for growth. I won't get really super into it, but it's really good if you're interested. And it's more advanced. So if you're in the mood for a more advanced, really good book, this is a good one. That I refer to a section on transits, and she asks questions of for you to food for thought with transits and how to go about thinking about the major outer planet transits. I find it really helpful. All right. Bernadette Brady is really advanced. If you read pretty much any other book she writes, I've gotten lost. I've tried, but she's really advanced, pretty complicated. This is a really good book, Predictive Astrology, The Eagle and the Lark. This is when I describe transit math when I am writing or making videos. I am using her theory on transits. It is how to go about thinking about transits in terms of planets in your birth chart by house. And then kind of like what to expect during the transit and what the ultimate outcome of a transit will be. So this is how to do real astrology when you're reading for other people, telling them what to expect in terms of good outcomes, bad outcomes, challenging outcomes. This is the book that will explain to you how to do that. I have found that it works. I use it constantly. I can now do it really without thinking because I look at where a planet came from, where a planet is by transit and what houses that planet rules, if it's multiple, and that governs the outcome of what the transit will be. It sounds complicated. She helps you to make using the word charts sounds bad, but it's like a table rather than like a birth chart. She helps you make a table of that information to steer you toward predictive astrology and talking about what outcomes of transits will be and what to expect. It's very realistic, it's very useful, it's very functional, it's very dense, and so if you are more of an advanced student, read it. Get it, read it, understand it. It's perfectly doable. It's just the caveat that it's not so simple and not so easy. And I guess I should say, it took me quite a while to learn, and my method of learning was reading as much as my poor little brain could comprehend, and eventually I would get frustrated and literally throw a book across a room, usually while yelling, because I would be so frustrated that I did not understand what the hell these people were talking about. And that's when I would stop for the day. I'd go to sleep, I'd get up the next morning, and I'd try again, and it would usually make more sense. So that's not necessarily a good learning method. What I just described sounds more like torture, but basically that's my way of saying don't give up, because it is complicated, but it is possible to wrap your head around and understand. Progressions. Delineation of progressions. If you want to learn how to use progressions, which is not complicated to learn to do, it's a predictive method of astrology that works. This is the Bible for progressions. Sophia Mason, again, she hasn't steered me wrong. I don't know of another book she wrote. This is on Amazon, easy to find. You can just look up, again, many apps will show you what progressions you have. You can, and those, the apps are right for progressions. The apps, you don't need to process a chart in order to do progressions. So if you have an app that shows you what progressions you have, you could just get this book and look up your progressions and they would be correct. So this is the book for progressions, period, the end. Stephen Arroyo talks about progressions in the Astrology and Karma and Transformation book, which will give you an idea of what progressions are. Then you can use this book to begin to do them. Super simple, super easy, super straightforward, except for the part at the end she has something like 20 case studies of different progressions, which I get lost in. I look at them and I'm like, what? But she knows her stuff. This is a really good book for progressions. Richard Idemon. My understanding of Richard Idemon is that he died having published nothing and was friends with Liz Green, who got this book and then his other book. There are two books of his. They got published within the last year or so, and thank God. These are so good. This book, I was taking screenshots of covers. I think I have half of this book highlighted. It is comical the amount of highlighting that I have done, but this is the book that both of his books talk about what it means to have planets, like a lack of planets or a preponderance of planets by mode or by element in a more in-depth way than Stephen Arroyo does. So it talks about having a lot of something or not a lot of something and how to interpret that in charts. It's just so good. I love Richard Idemon. I'm so sad he died young. He had a lot to offer in terms of wisdom and experience with the people who he worked with. Both of his books are good. I would put them both on here, but I decided to put one out and then say read them both. Richard Idemon, if you haven't read anything he's written, and you do like to read astrology, read his books. Okay. Planets and solar returns. If you have astrology software that will calculate your solar return, or if you use astro.com and get your solar return chart, you want to know how to read it, Mary Fortier Shay's Planets and Solar Returns is for you. And guess what? If you start reading solar returns, it basically teaches you how to read charts generally, because solar returns are charts that are only valid for a year. So if you wanted to learn to read charts, you could get your own solar return, interpret it using this book, and the more charts you look at, the better you're going to be at astrology. But the thing about solar returns is you can find out whether you were right about what you said what you thought would happen, or what you would say would happen. You have a year to find out. So it's much lower stakes, unless you're predicting things for people, in which case be careful. But her book will walk you through Venus in the 9th house, Venus square Saturn. You know, if you have those things for the year, she'll tell you what those things mean. And so you can begin to kind of do the math and put things together. I read this for fun. I love solar returns. I think they're great. I really recommend this book. This is a go-to. Once again, Aaron Sullivan. This book is fascinating. You will find, the more you do astrology, there are repeating patterns in charts of people who are related to one another. Astrology of Family Dynamics kind of talks about why that might be, patterns that you see, how to maybe facilitate moving forward to break some generational patterns, or embrace the fact that there is a generational pattern. I remember the day that I read this, I hung out with a friend, and we went through multiple generations of different family members of hers and found a general lack of air throughout the family. And I could then look at this book and give her thoughts as to why that might be. That different members of her family, they were having more kids that didn't have any planets in air signs. And how? Like, how are things aligning that well and that beautifully that there is a whole bunch of earth or a whole bunch of fire, but no air? What's that about? So Aaron Sullivan talks about that. These types of patterns are incredibly common. You will not find charts that seem to be more intricately put together in terms of their connections than you will in family charts. I promise you. Super interesting, super fascinating. Can't recommend it enough if you want to get to that level of nerdiness. I put this last. Pluto, the Evolutionary Journey of the Soul. I put it last on purpose. If you don't read a lot of astrology, this is not a beginner's book. This is an intense book. It is about Pluto. It will help you understand your Pluto and the Plutos of those who are near and dear to you. It is not warm and fuzzy. Jeffrey Wolf Green is or was a genius. I don't know if he's alive or dead. He decided to depart from society and go live in the woods until he died there. That's my understanding of what his plan was. He was that kind of guy. He's that kind of guy. He's that intense. So this is not for the free-spirited, lighthearted people. This is for a depth understanding of what Pluto is and what Pluto does and what Pluto's about, your Pluto in your natal chart, and then also he brings in the lunar nodes. There are examples. It is very prescriptive. I read this, struggled to wrap my mind around it, went to an astrologer to get my chart read to make sure that I was doing it correctly when I was learning. And he asked me what I was reading, and I told him this book, and then he looked at me and said, "Why are you here?" Because he basically said, if you can understand this, I'm not going to tell you anything that you don't know. So if you're at that level, it's a good book. It's one of those, it feels kind of gossipy when you read it, and it feels like you know too much about the people around you if you know where their Pluto is by house and sign, and it's a little bit scary. I haven't found anything inaccurate about it. It's just really intense, really dense, and not that accessible. But if you would like to make your brain explode with a book, this would be a good book to use for that. So that's the last one. There's a second book he wrote. There's a volume 2. As you notice, this says volume 1. Volume 2 is almost as good, though if your brain explodes with volume 1, it's more of the same in volume 2. And he talks about Mars by sign, Venus by sign, and generally what those are about in relation to each other. And then more on Pluto in volume 2. But Jeffrey Wolf Green is not for the faint of heart. Those would be the only 2 books that I would recommend written by Jeffrey Wolf Green. And I'm not going to go into why, but at volume 1 and volume 2 of Pluto, Evolutionary Journey of the Soul, if you would like a very intense experience, then why not this very intense experience? Those are my recommendations. Hopefully you can kind of see the logic if you've read any of these, in what order I put them in. If you have questions, comments, concerns, you know where to find me. Again, I read all of these more constantly than you might think. I continue to refer to them, and these, in my opinion, are all good and offer valuable, worthwhile, and most importantly, correct information. None of these will steer you wrong. Some of them may be more intensely prescriptive than you might prefer, but they all offer good, dense information that helps give you an understanding of how astrology works without making you either too optimistic or too pessimistic. I think all of them are very realistic in terms of how astrology actually works, rather than how we might like it to work or how we might prefer it to work. And they help to weave astrology into the human experience that we are all having. I have more books. If there's how do I better understand Jupiter? There's a book for that. There's a book for Neptune. There's a book for Uranus. There's multiple books. But these are my favorites, and these are the ones that I think won't lead you wrong. Thank you for watching if you got all the way through this. Happy reading if I recommended something to you that you are interested to learn more about. See you next time.